Hello, and welcome back to LTC Heroes Live, where we talk about real stories, tips, and tools from the leaders of long term care. We are joined today by Dr. Jane Fleishman. She's a certified sexuality educator and author of the Stonewall Generation. I know, Victoria, my co-host here, that you're excited because you read through the book. You and I chatted on Monday, and we talked about it today. I'm also excited to welcome her to the program. Dr. Jane, welcome to LTC Heroes.
Thank you so much, Peter and Victoria. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to dive in. Victoria is the one who's prepared the majority of this. I'm going to start off with one question, then turn it over to her. Dr.
Sure.
Jane, why a book called The Stonewall Generation?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you, Peter. I must say that there aren't very many books about the LGBTQ elders experience, right? And when I finished my doctoral research, which was statistical research on LGBTQ elders and sexual satisfaction, was a really interesting project. I longed for the stories behind the numbers. I really wanted to hear people's stories. And I wanted to offer an idea out to the general public that this was a group of people whose lives had been missed and who'd been invisible. And they were people who either came of age or came out as LGBTQ individuals during the time of that very heady, exciting political turmoil time in the 1960s around the Stonewall Rebellion. And so I started calling them the Stonewall generation, and it kind of made sense. It took off for me, and people liked it. People I interviewed, I interviewed people all over the country, but the people I interviewed really liked this idea that I was giving them a name. They were no longer the baby boomers or something like that, right? They were the Stonewall generation, and they really took to that. So it was a matter of reverence, I would say.
I actually want to start by thanking you for writing this piece because it's actually something that I read in your book that I think was Mandy Carter that said it, but correct me if I'm wrong. She said something along the lines of all you know is all you know until something different comes along and
Yeah,
then you learn from it, right? And
yeah,
this is exactly what I felt throughout the book because I'm young and I'm not used like I these people lived lives so different than mine
mm,
and I had no
mm,
idea and your book
mm,
really enlightened me. So thank you. And
mm.
I guess my follow-up question would be what is the story or the finding that you found writing the book that most shocked you or that you felt like it was something that you were not expecting and
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Great. Thanks, Victoria. Mandy Carter is a hero of mine. I hope you have her on your show someday. She's fantastic. She's in her 70s. She's a Black African American lesbian who has been fighting as an activist for civil rights against the war and for LGBTQ rights for 50 years, right? She's amazing. And Mandy is right on when she says, you only know what you know. You don't know what you don't know. When I was a kid, I thought I knew everything. Now I'm in my late 60s. I know I don't know very much, right? So I'm learning all the time. And I feel the same as you. I'm learning every time I talk to people. And particularly talking with these elders who are really my heroes and have become friends, by the way. It's really been wonderful. Um, some of the discoveries were painful. So, for instance, if you grow up cisgender and heterosexual and white and tall and able bodied and thin, you get where I'm going here, Victoria, you feel like there's pictures of you in the world. There's images that represent who you are. If you're none of the above, or if you're only a few of the above, if you're black or brown, if you're fat, if you're disabled, if you're queer in any way, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and if you're of the age over 45 or 50, you feel invisible. And for me, one of the greatest discoveries was not just that these individuals felt invisible to the rest of the world, but some of them felt invisible inside what we think of as the umbrella of the LGBTQ population. For instance, Lani Kahumanu, who's a bisexual woman who was really she's known as one of the chief architects of the bisexual rights movement in this country, in the US. She said when she came out as a lesbian, she was heralded. And later on, when she realized that she was bisexual, she was shunned by her own community. That kind of invisibility, if you will, or hostility or internalized oppression was something that I knew about anecdotally being a part of this community. I'm an older lesbian and I've seen that happen, but I didn't know the extent to which it occurred. I guess another point that I learned that was not shocking, but a great discovery was I was interested in this term resilience. How do you get up in the morning after things have gone bad, like for decades, right? How do you continue? But Victoria, what I learned was that in the book, the people that I interviewed, by and large, represented what I think of now as collective resilience, or resilience across a population that has endured difficulties for a long time. And those are two really different kinds of discoveries, but also two really important learnings for me as a researcher and also as an educator.
Dr. Jane, I'm interested in what the reaction has been from readers who don't consider them part of the Stonewall generation, whether they be in long-term care or they, define themselves as heterosexual, and this is new to them. What have you heard?
Yeah, great. Couple of really interesting things. Just last week, I was at an assisted living community, and I was downstairs in the big community room, and they were also live streaming me to people's apartments upstairs. So if you didn't feel like you wanted to come downstairs for any reason, you could watch. And about halfway through my talk, it was about a 1 hour talk, and I was talking about the book. Um, and you never know what people's sexual orientation is, right? You can't tell. So I was just talking to people about what it was like to write the book and sort of, what some of the stories were. This woman comes in, and at the very end, she comes up to me and she goes, I was watching you upstairs in my apartment, but I had to I raced downstairs, and she's on a walker, which I thought was great. Like she raced on her walker, and she gets there halfway through, and she says to me, my granddaughter is gay and she's great. And I thought, right on, Grandma, that's perfect. So again, so many of us have members of our families or friends who consider themselves and identify as part of the LGBTQ communities.
Hmm.
I thought that was a great response. I've also found responses from people I used to do activist work, social justice work, when I lived in Hartford, Connecticut about 20 years ago. And one of them was a straight guy who I'd worked with, and he gave my book out as a Christmas present to 5 of his closest activist friends, all of whom, as far as I knew, were straight. And I thought, wow, that's great. He's giving this book out as a way of bringing hope to them about activist struggles. And then the last thing I want to say is I had 2 or 3 audiences in mind. One was the elders themselves. The other was young people who wanted to learn about history. And I think young people have really taken a real liking to my book because these are really important stories that they've never heard, particularly because a lot of quote unquote gay rights history has been whitewashed. People their skin tone is like mine and lighter, and they don't realize that it wasn't just Harvey Milk, a white guy, who was active, but, for instance, Miss Major Griffin Gracie, who is a Black trans woman who was a sex worker at the time, who was at the bar, and she describes what it's like in the bar that night. And so young people are very excited to read these stories because you don't get them anywhere else. So.
Dr. Jane, there have to be a few young people who are going to listen to this or watch this recording who might not even know what Stonewall is. So could you give a 1 minute or 2 minute introduction so someone understands the questions, but also I'm interested in what you learned yourself
Yeah.
beyond the discovery, but what you learned about the history going back into the Stonewall generation.
Yeah, great. Stonewall Tavern was and is a bar where a lot of gay people from a lot of different cultural and ethnic and racial groups used to hang out, and some still do. And it's a bar on Christopher Street in the West Village, in Greenwich Village in New York City, which was, by the way, in 1969 when the Stonewall Rebellion occurred on June 28th. It started that night. We don't know how long it went on for, by the way, Peter. We don't have really good recorded history of a lot of oppressed groups' struggles, right? And so in this case, we think it went on from June 28th, late in the night, for 5 or 6 days, but we don't really know for sure. In any case, it was a bar that people hung out in. And in those days, it was illegal to serve liquor to homosexuals based on a New York City law, and in many cities. And most of the bars were owned by the mafia. And there was a kind of a tacit agreement between the bartenders and the police, whereby an envelope of cash would be handed to the police officer who came to the bar, and that would signify that that night was free of any kind of political or police harassment. But the night of June 28th, something else happened, something completely different. And it wasn't planned. That's the other thing to remember for your listeners. It wasn't a planned event, it was totally spontaneous. Police raids in gay bars at the time were very common. And when the money didn't pass, people were put into paddy wagons and police cars and thrown into jail. And because people were closeted, they were very afraid to fight back. And if you think about the early 60s, late 50s, there weren't very many places where you could be out of the closet and feel comfortable. And so that night was a little bit different. And nobody knows exactly what happened, Peter. Some people say someone threw a beer bottle. Somebody says something else. So what I discovered was there's about 100 different stories, or maybe 1,000 different stories. It's like what Kate Bornstein and Barbara Carellis wrote in the forward of my book. They said it's like when you went to Woodstock. Everybody was there. Well, you couldn't have all been there, but anyway,
I think that was
everybody's got a different story.
my favorite
Right,
part at the
right.
beginning of the book, because it's the grandpa who walked in snow up to school and then up the hill back from school. And then when you mentioned that about Woodstock, I'm like, oh yeah, I feel the same way. I feel like my aunt and uncle told me they were all there too.
Right, right. So we don't really know what happened. In the book, I chose one story that came up again and again, and that's a story about Stormy de la Riviere, who was a short, butch, mixed race lesbian who got thrown into a paddy wagon. She got out. She went back in 3 times. The cops tried to put her in there. And finally, she looked at all the guys standing outside the bar and she says, "Why don't you guys do something?" And I love that. And I love that she kind of helped put that forward. But do I know that that really happened? No, that's my story. That was my discovery. But the other thing I discovered was that Stonewall was certainly not the first time that people fought back against this kind of intimidation, harassment, and police violence. And of course, it wasn't the last time, but it was seen as the beginning of the modern quote unquote gay rights movement. But there were other places, other times in history, 10 years earlier in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, and right there in New York. In fact, I don't know if you guys knew this, but there were sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, and other parts of the South where Black young people would sit in at a counter and ask to be served a soda or a milkshake. And in those sit-ins, they were creating a civil disobedience action where they were thereby taking into their own hands this idea that segregation needed to be overturned. part of the civil rights movement in the 60s. Well, some gay rights activists took the idea of sit-ins and called them sip-ins, and gay people sat at a bar and asked for a beer in a straight bar, and they were carted away and brought into jail as a part of their civil disobedience, and were able to change the laws in New York City. So really interesting ways that these social justice and civil rights movements intersected with each other.
Dr. Jane, given that we work in long-term care, I want to ask, when you went about writing, I'm guessing you did this, first of all, it was an extension of your PhD. Did you have any idea that you were going to have, like our peers in long-term care reach out to you and ask for you to go to assisted living and skilled nursing and teach them their employees? Or was this like such a shock to you?
It wasn't really a shock. It was a hope, right, Peter? I mean, this is where I spend most of my time. Most of my work as an educator is in long-term care. As you and I have discussed in the past, I go to assisted living communities, nursing homes, I go to senior centers. I go to a lot of long-term care places where people are already interested in one taboo topic, which is sex. And then when I introduce this second taboo topic about LGBTQ elders, people sort of scratch their heads most of the places, but in the places that I go to, they're really all about it because there's a lot of caring, amazingly compassionate people that I've connected with who are pretty forward thinking and they want to hear about this. There's also a lot of training going on in my state in Massachusetts about how to care for LGBTQ elders in long-term care. So it sort of dovetailed a lot. And I have to say, I'm always surprised at the compassion that's out there with the general public, but I'm always really thrilled when I see the compassion that people in long-term care have for all different types of individuals.
I have a question in terms of what has been your learning curve, right? Because talking about LGBT could be its own specialty at the doctoral level at the University of Massachusetts. Long-term care is another. Sexuality and sex is another. What has been the learning curve for you about learning to talk to employees, workers in long-term care, and also the residents at the facilities that you go to? Because you're going across many different spectrums of speciality.
Yeah. When I first got my PhD in human sexuality, Peter, I thought, great, I'll go to sexuality conferences and I'll talk to them about old people having sex. Well, most sexuality professionals thought, so everybody has sex. We know that. We're sexuality professionals. I realized, okay, good learning. Second thing I learned was when I go to long-term care communities, people are really very hip to the idea that old people can be well in many different dimensions, and they talk about wellness in so many different ways, but they don't really know very much about sexuality. What they know about sexuality is about non-consensual, non-mutual sexual abuse, right? That's what they know about. Or they know about people with cognitive decline who want to be sexual and may not be wanting to be sexual with the right quote unquote person, right? So I realized that I'm on a mission to promote the sexual wellness of older adults, particularly those who are living in long-term care, and particularly those who come from marginalized populations like LGBTQ seniors. And when I get to that funnel, right, I start here and I keep going, I lose some people and I keep some people with me, but I've had to learn a lot about how to talk between two worlds, to gerontologists and to sexuality professionals. And now this third group, which is older adults themselves, who I love to talk about. So now I'm developing some online learning tools for older adults who want to learn more about what's the research on sexuality for older adults and what's fact, what's opinion, what's values, what's fiction, right? And so That's been great too.
I want to pause on that and ask specifically, what are things that you have changed? Are there sex toys that you took in 3 years ago that you don't take in today because you're like, maybe I'll take that on the third time they visit, or this joke I'll no longer say, this they found this offensive, I just didn't judge my audience, I'll tone this down. Anything that has changed the way that you approach your talks?
One way that I've changed is I now find out what the religious affiliation is of the place that I'm going to. So here's two examples where I've gotten into trouble, Peter. I like getting into trouble, by the way. John Lewis once said, we need good trouble. And Bayard Rustin, who is he was really the chief strategist for Dr. Martin Luther King's March on Washington in 1963, who was a Black man, who was a communist, who was also gay, but nobody knew about it because he was so afraid of driving a wedge in the movement. Anyway, Bayard Rustin called us angelic troublemakers. I like that. I want to be an angelic troublemaker till I die. Anyway, I learned this twice. Once I went to a facility that was run by the diocese. So it was a Catholic church. And I put out condoms and lube, like I always do. I always I have a basket here in my office of condoms and dental dams and lube, and people love it. People go crazy. The staff loves it. The older adults love it. I never come back with any, and that's my goal. At the end of the talk, no, at the very beginning of the talk, one of the guys said to me, you can't pass out condoms here. I said, why? He says, we don't believe in them. I said, okay, I got it. Like, that was good to learn. The second time I learned it was, I said the word masturbation in another religious institution, this one run by the Salvation Army. And I was allowed to stay, but at the end of it, someone said to me, we don't use that word around here. And I got it. I just got it. So I've learned to kind of do a little bit more research before I begin. And, I'm a sex educator. I'm used to people being uncomfortable. It's okay. But my work has to be to adapt it in a way that people can hear it. So sex toys, I bring all sorts of sex toys. One of the great perks of being in this business is all the sex toy companies want to send me free samples that I get to demo. So I've got a big box over here, and I bring them. And I've got my penis puppet and my vulva puppet. I don't always bring those out right the first hour. I sometimes wait, but people are very intrigued because never underestimate, Peter, how little sex education people get in the U.S. And so I feel like I'm the one person that may talk to them about not just sexually transmitted infections, but also about pleasure. And pleasure is so important.
Before I ask you about your creative process and the way that you approach the book and the order and outline and, what you did research wise, I'll share a little personal tangent. I've given you probably 10% of this or 20% of this when you and I first met maybe a month or two ago. So I grew up in Kansas, religious school, and I can remember they canceled my sex education, I think in second or third grade, because they caught me pointing at the penis and laughing. So they just canceled the class and never got any more. And hold on, I never, ever got sexual education ever again. Not from an aunt, not from an uncle. It was kind of like watching movies and trying to figure out what older kids were talking about, but never asked them a question. And then when I got out of college in the Boston area, my first job was as an HIV/AIDS caseworker for the homeless population in Lynn. And I remember exactly what you're saying. You brought out a basket of condoms and toys and things like that in my training to be a caseworker. And I was embarrassed as a fifth grader. And I was becoming an HIV/AIDS caseworker. And the different colored condoms. And then they told me some of them smelled like sour apple. And I wanted to open them up and smell them or chew on them, but I was terrified like a 12-year-old. So I would be that, take me back 20 years ago, I would have been that embarrassed audience that you were talking about.
Oh, that's great. Peter, I love it. I wish I had seen your face back then. That would have made me really laugh.
Terrified. And then, like 6 months later and the baby in the bathwater, I was like, oh, I can embrace it. And then I was taking them home to my parents. My parents like, this is not welcome here. You don't bring sour apple condoms to Kansas.
So, Peter, just so you know, some of the greatest sex educators in our field have been from Kansas. Just saying, really great people. So There's a great cartoon of a little kid on his laptop typing in, and the dad walks up to him over his shoulder and says, "Hey, son, I think it's time that we talk about sex." And the kid turns around and says, "Okay, Dad, what do you want to know?" so, so that speaks to me in a way that I think your experience spoke to you, that we get very little sex ed. It's not very joyful. It's very fear-based. I'm in my 60s, and when I was in school, the only sex ed we got was girls keep your knees together, which didn't do much for me. But anyway, girls keep your knees together, don't get pregnant, also didn't do much for me. And um, AIDS didn't even exist yet. So it was just don't get gonorrhea, chlamydia, all the other sexually transmitted infections. Fear-based sex ed really doesn't work. It doesn't work for anyone. And I was invited once to a day treatment facility for older adults where you get a bus to go there from your either your home or your apartment or your community, and they wanted me to do a workshop. And I said, "Great. Have you ever done any sex education for your older clients before?" And they said, "Yeah, we had this guy in last year who was a medical student, and all he talked about was how not to get sexually transmitted infections." It didn't go over so good. I said, "Of course it's not going to go over so good. It's never gone over so good. It's a terrible way to teach about sex. People know this idea that fear is not the way to teach." And I come from this idea that yes, older adults have lots of fears, lots of loss, and lots of sadness. But there's also space for emergent, what I call emergent pleasure. And that when we're older, we don't have as many hang-ups about who's going to think badly of me, or I don't want to disappoint my parents, or I'm going to get pregnant. I mean, I guess you might be able to get pregnant, but it's a far cry for most of us who have been through menopause. We're also not as afraid of disappointing someone. And so for many older adults, it's really kind of it's an unburdening that I love to talk about that could mean discovery. It could be challenging oneself to think about sex in a whole new way. Or instead of just penis and vagina intercourse, maybe I use this term, it's not a real word, but I use this term outer course. It's this idea that sex educators use to get people to think about any kind of sexual behavior that you might engage in that hasn't anything to do with penetration. So, Peter, use your mind. Don't tell us what you're thinking, but use your mind. Lots of ideas come to mind. And that's another way that my work has changed. You asked me about, do I not tell certain jokes anymore? Sometimes I just let people, I let people really find the joy in thinking about sex in new ways. That instead of me telling a joke, it's them finding the joy in thinking about sex, and that's been really lovely for me. Um, and I guess the last thing I want to say about this is that sex education in the U.S. has been really dominated by this idea of abstinence only. That's what the right-wing conservative movement has really pushed. And many states have really followed suit. And there's very few states in this country where you have to give factually based, medically accurate, comprehensive sexuality education. But that's only K through 12. What happens once you get out of high school and you're 18 years old? Unless you go to college and there's some really good RA on your floor in your dormitory, you're going to go through most of your life the way I think many people have done. And, the way that you've described some of your own background, where maybe porn has been your